So my name's Jim Wades. My amateur call is WB8SIW. And today we're going to talk about the early history of radio. Back when I first put this program together, there was no such thing as PowerPoint. Uh, there were 35 millimeter slide carousels, and projectors, etc., etc. But I presented this course and earlier iterations at many radio clubs throughout Michigan and Indiana and Ohio and sometimes in other parts of the country. And right off the bat, I'm not an expert, but I think it's a fun and entertaining program. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those long lost days of the maybe first 3 decades or so, or maybe a bit into the 19th century of radio. That when I first got involved in amateur radio and so forth, the very earliest pioneers were still alive, accessible. One could sit down with them and discuss the early days of wireless communications. It wasn't uncommon, for example, growing up in Detroit to walk into Herschel Electronics down there on Grand River Avenue and talk to the gentleman who had received the first amateur radio license from the Department of Commerce in 1912. Unfortunately for today's generation of radio amateurs, that door on that opportunity has pretty much closed, unless you were maybe licensed, 50 years ago or maybe 40 years ago, and that's kind of a shame. So the purpose of this is to kind of give people a taste of the early days of radio and talk a little bit about the progress and so forth. So obviously, you can't really start a program on the early history of radio without talking about Maxwell and Hertz. And I suspect everybody here is kind of familiar with the equations of Maxwell and the experiments of Hertz to prove the existence and characteristics of electromagnetic radiation. And of course, you might consider Hertz's experiment here the first transmitter and receiver. You have essentially what Hertz did is he built up a corner reflector, a small, almost dipole type antenna, resonant at about 220 megahertz, roughly, as a matter of fact. And he built an identical type of receiving antenna, and he placed these parabolic reflectors in opposite corners of the room. And when he excited the transmitter with via a spark gap, he could see an induced spark in the receive antenna on the other side of the room. And this this proved the existence of electromagnetic waves and the theories of Maxwell and others. And so you might consider this the first 220 megahertz transmitter and receiver, or at least thereabouts. And of course, this immediately opens the door to further experimentation. And of course, this is where the term Hertz comes from. We don't say cycles per second anymore. We say Hertz. And yes, Hertz rents cars as well, but not exactly related to the same subject. But anyway, so Hertz really gives birth to radio communications. Now, suffice to say, I have an hour and a half, maybe at the most, in this program. There are others who experimented with early radio, right? We've heard of Loomis and people experimented also with inductive systems of wireless communications, etc. But Marconi really gets the credit because Marconi was the first to really put the pieces together to develop a practical communication system. And that's why we honor Marconi really as I guess basically the inventor of radio. And I guess you might say any new development in an era that placed a very high emphasis on industriousness, creativity, and the progress of technology and science. Marconi's developments really caught the public's attention. And sure enough, it didn't take long for others to imitate his experiments and to begin experimenting with wireless communications. Certainly, the famous letter S transmitted across the Atlantic in 1901 was a major impetus. It made the newspapers all around the world, feature magazine articles and so forth. Even popular magazines like Cosmopolitan featured articles about wireless communications. In many respects, it caught the public's imagination in much the same way the early, say, public access and development of the internet did. It was truly a revolutionary type concept, and I guess you might say the real the real impetus for the development of wireless communications begins with Marconi's experiment of transmitting the letter S across the Atlantic to St. John's, Newfoundland. And immediately people began experimenting with wireless communications. As I said, Marconi really developed the first practical wireless systems. And of course, one of the early challenges in wireless communications was the detector. Probably the earliest, I guess you might call it practical detector, was the coherer. Now, the coherer was essentially a two metal electrodes with some very fine metal filings in between them. In the presence of a radio signal, they would cohere, or essentially align and conduct. And this would operate a pen register or a similar type of telegraphic device. And the problem with the coherer, of course, is that you had to have what's called a decoherer, essentially much like a bell clapper that after each telegraphic impulse released or knocked the filings loose for the next telegraphic impulse. Maximum speed, I seem to recall, was somewhere in the range of maybe 12 to 15 words a minute. So the coherer was pretty impractical, insensitive, slow, and it was not what was called self-restoring. So this led ultimately to the development of the magnetic detector. And the magnetic detector is essentially a clock-like mechanism that draws an iron wire, you might say, through a magnetic field. And of course, this is induced in a way that you can detect a radio signal. And this might have been something you would see on very early shipboard wireless installations. Again, a step above the coherer detector, but still, rather crude. But really, maritime wireless was the first practical application, right? It was logical. The telegraph industry had already been very well established. If you think about it, the telegraph industry in at least North America and Europe had been developing since the 1840s, 1850s. And so, in terms of the ability for wireless communications, particularly at the early crude technological state, to compete with the telegraph industry was really, essentially impossible. But where you obviously couldn't use commercial telegraph common carriers would be at sea. And wireless was adapted fairly quickly for maritime communications, both on the sea as well as on the Great Lakes. Interestingly, we began to see a kind of a dichotomy develop in these early days. We see two different wireless stations here. This one's in Duluth, Minnesota on the Great Lakes, and this is on the East Coast. Generally, in these early days, you had a mixture of codes on the air. You had, for example, the international code. At the time, it would have been referred to as the continental code for ocean-going vessels in this early era, maybe the first decade or decade and a half of wireless communications in the 20th century. But on the Great Lakes, you had American Morse code as the standard. So at this point in time, there's no government regulation of wireless communications. There's no licensing. There's no specific standards. But nonetheless, it rapidly develops. And here you can see some samples of early wireless installations on board ship. And of course, the standard was spark transmitters, and some of these different receiving technologies like magnetic detectors and things of this nature. So maritime wireless is really the first practical application of wireless communications, both particularly commercially. Now, there were early inventors and developers like Lee DeForest who attempted to create commercial point-to-point wireless communications networks. They were generally economic flops. For example, here's a DeForest or United Wireless, I think it's a United Wireless station at Colorado Springs. Generally, these were not successful ventures, but what they did make was nice fodder for stock speculators, particularly stock manipulators, who wanted to build companies to essentially get capital and convert it to their own use. And many of these early commercial wireless systems essentially went bankrupt, but usually not until they had enriched their stock manipulators quite nicely. Lee DeForest was very much caught up in many of these things. Like any new technology, you find that there's people that dream of becoming rich rather quickly. We saw this in the early days of the internet, with the internet bubble, back in the 1980s and 90s, right? We saw this also in radio. There was an antecedent for it, an analog, and this was the people who invested in any kind of wireless offering in hopes that they would get rich. A good example here is a guy named Collins, not related to Art Collins of Collins Radio, but Frederick Collins, who developed a primitive radio telephone system. He got in a lot of legal trouble for this, but essentially he got involved with some stock manipulators and investors, and they convinced many people, many cities and municipalities, that this would replace unsightly telephone lines, and that the technology was sufficiently advanced that any one radio telephone could communicate with any other radio telephone without interference, which of course was untrue. As a matter of fact, if I recall correctly, this is Barry Goldwater's grandfather being given a demonstration of one of these early Collins radio telephone devices. He's really the poster child, maybe not quite as much as Dr. Lee DeForest, for being taken in and maybe becoming a little too close to these stock manipulators and the like. But if you look at new technological innovations, and maybe this is a warning to those looking to invest in various AI schemes, in the early days of telegraphy, many people lost fortunes investing in, excessive promises of stock manipulators. The same was true in early wireless communications, and the same was true with the internet. And it'll probably be the same as long as people and money exist on the planet. Of course, the fascination with radio communications methods, or wireless as it was called at the time, was not limited to the commercial interests. Radio amateurs quickly emerge in the first, even well within the first decade of the 20th century. And at the time, again, there was no regulation. You could operate on whatever wavelength you wanted. If you could build a bigger and better amateur radio station than the local commercial operation, and you ended up running them off the air, there really wasn't anything you could do about it. And sometimes the amateur stations were better. But amateur radio quickly takes off as a fascinating hobby. And of course, it's really first adopted by young men, boys and young men, just like hackers and so forth in the early internet era. And so wireless communications very much takes the imagination of youth. The youth are very vested in novelty. And in many respects, early radio amateurs were boys. It was a boys' hobby. And it's interesting, if you look at the demographics of amateur radio over the 20th century, the age gradually increases, the average age of radio amateurs gradually increases from this early era of the 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s up into our present day era, where it's generally a retiree's hobby, right? And it's rather an elderly hobby. But certainly boys were fascinated with wireless communications, just as is the typical nature of youth. Early amateur radio stations, most were very crude. So this would be kind of a typical amateur radio station. You might have a spark coil basically connected directly to an antenna and earth. And you might have a single slide or three slide, crystal detector type receiver, or some type of self-restoring detector, an electrolytic detector or the like. And you can imagine that there wasn't much selectivity in this, nor was there a very high Q. I mean, you didn't transmit very far under these kinds of conditions. A very broad signal, you're covering a pretty good sized chunk of the spectrum, and the receivers were probably equally ineffective in terms of their ability to tune sharply, you might say. But this was typical, a typical small amateur radio station, say, around 1910 or, 1915, whatever the case might be. Very crude, very simple. Parks on the Air has been something that's actually been around from the beginning. This is the first Parks on the Air transceiver from 1907. Of course, I'm joking, but no sooner did radio amateurs start experimenting with wireless communications than they start to figure out ways to deploy portable communications equipment. So if you think portable operating is something that developed with POTA or SOTA, you have a little bit of a surprise coming. And this is an early portable transceiver from about 1907. As I mentioned earlier, in the early days of wireless communications, there were actually 3 different Morse codes in use for a time. There's the familiar Continental code that we still essentially use today, with just a few modifications. And then, of course, there was the original mother tongue, the American Morse code, which was generally used on the Great Lakes. And then for a time, the Navy had its own radio telegraph code. The Navy, they do things better, and they've got to do it their own way. So anyway, this Navy experiment with its own unique radio telegraph code obviously did not last long. And as a matter of fact, it's not really in the purview of this program, but at various times in the history of the United States, there have been 4 different Morse codes. There, in the telegraph era, there was the Bain code for the Bain chemical telegraph. So we've had it at different times 4 different Morse codes. I should say wireless or telegraph or radio telegraph codes in use in the United States. Early receivers do kind of progress. If you were a radio amateur, say in the early teens, you might have had a loose coupler. A loose coupler is a very selective receiver. The primary has taps, much like a double slide tuner or the like. And then, of course, there's a secondary portion of this receiving transformer, and that also has taps, but you can slide this in and out for maximum selectivity. They perform quite well, actually, as crystal receivers go. And that's probably one of the big improvements in early crystal receiver technology in, say, the 19-teens. And you can buy these or build them, whichever you needed to do. If you look over here, this looks like a telephone receiver, probably relatively low resistance coil. I don't recall what those are, maybe 75 ohms, not particularly sensitive. So again, progress in receiver technology in the say first 15 or so years of the 20th century. Basic single, double, triple slide tuners, etc., and eventually loose couplers. Now, we commonly use the term CW for continuous wave, and we tend to use it synonymously to mean radio telegraphy. But in fact, continuous wave is different than the type of radio telegraphy that occurred during the spark era or the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So the way in the early days of wireless, the spark transmitter produced a damped oscillation. And so you might think of a damped oscillation as the ringing of a bell. So if you look here at this diagram, each time a spark jumped the gap, it would ring an LC circuit, okay, which would ring at its resonant frequency with decreasing amplitude. So with each spark impulse, this basically starts out with maximum and it rings with decrement, okay? And then again, next, time the spark jumps the gap, it re-excites that LC circuit, and this creates what's called a damped oscillation. And so when you receive this damped oscillation, say via your tuning network, and you rectify it with, say, an electrolytic detector or a crystal detector, it gives you a rectified waveform somewhat like this. And of course, with the telephones and the earphones and the like, this is what you hear. And so you would hear a buzzing, okay? You didn't need a beat frequency oscillator because it was a damped oscillation, okay? And so again, that's kind of how the signals were structured. So here's a loose coupler circuit, pretty typical arrangement, say if you're a radio amateur, say in 1915, and then of course a detector. And generally speaking, as wireless begins to mature in these early years of the 20th century, we have two competing methods of detection, right? A self-restoring detector, one of which was the electrolytic detector developed by the Canadian inventor Fessenden. Lee DeForest stole this invention and marketed it under the name of the DeForest responder because Lee DeForest was a bit of a cad and sometimes an intellectual property thief. And so he called it the responder, but it was really developed by Fessenden. And it was a fairly effective diode, you might say, okay? And then, of course, we have the crystal detector. Here's DeForest, and this is, I can't think of this guy's name at the moment, but he was his financial backer, and he was really a stock manipulator and a thief. And for some reason, DeForest just, ended up with these people. I guess he didn't exercise good discernment. But DeForest took Fessenden's invention and called it the responder. Probably the thing that DeForest is most famous for is the 3-element vacuum tube, the triode. He called it the Audion. Now, DeForest was a bit of a doodler. He wasn't a theoretical physicist. He wasn't a theoretical engineer, really. He kind of operated sort of as a doodler, kind of an empirical experimenter, maybe to use a nicer term. I think Gertrude Tyne, who was a historian of the vacuum tube in her own right, along with her husband Gerald Tyne, coined the term doodler for DeForest. The reality is that he took an invention from John Ambrose Fleming of the diode vacuum tube, and he inserted the grid, and he called it the Audion. So Fleming basically developed or took the Edison effect, and he went ahead and used that to create the diode vacuum tube as a detector. DeForest, of course, in his experiments and so forth, he went ahead and inserted a grid. Now, DeForest never really fully understood how his vacuum tube operated. He tended to believe it worked on some kind of ionization principle. And as a result, these were very soft vacuum tubes. By soft, it's an old-fashioned term meaning that they weren't fully evacuated. And as a result, they weren't really capable of significant amplification, although they could, under the right conditions, be a reasonably sensitive detector. But because DeForest didn't understand how his vacuum tube worked, he really never capitalized in a way that he could have put it to work as an amplifier or oscillator. It really took a young man named Armstrong to unleash the power of the Audion or vacuum tube. So you see that there's, as soon as DeForest invents the vacuum tube, you see others begin to duplicate his invention. A good example is Elmer Cunningham, who began marketing the Audiotron on the West Coast. It's essentially a bootleg DeForest Audion, and it's a mystery to this day how he didn't end up in court, losing some kind of court battle to prevent him from manufacturing vacuum tubes. But Cunningham, basically his company survived well into the mid 20th century. So essentially the triode vacuum tube, at least in the early days, was relatively ineffective, and there weren't really many ways to apply it. It took this young man on the right here, Edwin Howard Armstrong, to really unleash the power of the vacuum tube through the development of the regenerative receiver and later the superheterodyne. Armstrong, however, did have the advantage that in the intervening years between the invention of the Audion and his development of regeneration or the regenerative receiver in 1912, and eventually the superheterodyne in 1918, engineers at Bell Labs and others had come to understand the nature of vacuum tubes, and they began to manufacture vacuum tubes that were properly evacuated had an appropriate vacuum and getters and things of this nature, so that higher plate voltages could be applied, and they understood the functions of the control grid and things of this nature. Armstrong's first great invention was regeneration. This is his first regenerative receiver on display at Columbia University. The regenerative receiver is pretty simple in concept, really, at least looking back in retrospect. What we basically do is we take our detector tube and we basically feed some of the signal from the plate back into the input. And so you create this positive feedback type principle. And this goes ahead and greatly amplifies the RF signal. And for the first time, the vacuum tube is really effective as a detector and as an RF amplifier. And also, obviously, it's very easy to discern the fact that with the right amount of coupling and so forth, it can become an oscillator. And this is pretty revolutionary in radio communications. And so regeneration is one of the first big steps in wireless communications. And it comes along at just the right time in the history of amateur radio, because in 1912, the Radioactive 1912 is passed. And the hidden agenda behind the Radioactive 1912 was to destroy the amateur radio service. And this was done by limiting amateur radio operators to the supposedly useless wavelength of 200 meters, which is about 1,500 kilohertz, 1.5 megahertz, roughly the top of the broadcast band. And it was at the time thought that this was a very poor area of the radio spectrum. Anything above 200 meters was essentially useless. And if we put radio amateurs up at 200 meters, they would cease to exist in just a matter of time. They did not foresee the advancements in technology, particularly improvements in the spark transmitter and improvements in radio receiving courtesy of regeneration and the like. So radio amateurs adopt the newer techniques like synchronous rotary spark gap transmitters, regenerative receiver, the Audion or the vacuum tube, and they also begin to organize, particularly with the creation of the American Radio Relay League by Mr. Maxim, Hiram Percy Maxim, and Clarence Tuska in 1914. And amateur radio begins to progress very rapidly, and in some ways outperform, commercial research interests. For example, this is station 2 p.m. in New York City, which achieved the first transcontinental QSO in the period of around 1914 or so. Early radio receivers and transmitters begin to improve dramatically. This is a rotary spark gap transmitter with at 2 p.m. With a bunch of Leyden jars, a 2 kilowatt United Wireless coffin transformer, a rotary spark gap, and then of course this is your oscillation transformer. And it works a bit like a loose coupler connected to the antenna. So spark technology is improving dramatically too, not just in terms of power, but also we're learning to manage this damped oscillation rather well. And one of the ways you can improve the efficiency of a spark transmitter is by increasing the number of basically discharges per second. And this tends to deliver more power to the LC circuit. It keeps it ringing at a higher amplitude, delivers more current to the antenna, and the rotary spark gap becomes kind of the standard for a good amateur radio station in that period, say 1912, 1914 to 1917. And so we began to see the rotary spark gap transmitter emerge, and again in the these early years before World War I. There's essentially two types of rotary gap transmitters. There's the asynchronous, and then there's the synchronous transmitter. And the synchronous transmitter is kind of the peak of spark gap technology, where these particular electrodes line up at the peak of every cycle at the spark transformer primary, typically fed off of 110 volts at say 50 hertz or 60 hertz, whatever your power grid was operating at. And that meant that you had a very clean signal and narrower bandwidth and more power delivered. So what you might see here, this is an asynchronous arrangement. Synchronous spark gaps had these positive and negative pulses lined up whenever the rotary gap was lined up in synchronization with the basic waveform and the transformer primary. And this gave a lot more efficiency to spark transmitters. And spark transmitters were widely used also in commercial services. This is the famous NAA at Arlington, Virginia. And here you can see the rotary spark gap, and then of course the tuning networks, et cetera, et cetera. NAA was probably the first radio station that drove the consumer use of wireless receivers, particularly by jewelers, because they send out time signals every day. And so for example, the first radio receiver installed in Pontiac, Michigan was installed at the V.L. Chamberlain jewelry store at 35 North Saginaw in downtown Pontiac. Again, jewelers were early adopters of wireless communications because they wanted a receiver to get free time service. They didn't have to pay Western Union. If you were a ham in 1915, instead of going to DX Engineering or Ham Radio Outlet, you might have gone to the Electro Importing Company, which was founded by Gernsback. You can see some of the products available here in the catalog. I'm sure more than one young man or boy kept this catalog under his pillow at night, dreaming of owning some of these devices. Okay. The problem with spark transmitters, however, is that they're relatively inefficient under the best circumstances. So with the development of vacuum tubes and the use of the vacuum tube as an RF oscillator and amplifier, the continuous wave emerged in amateur radio. But before that, engineers were trying to figure out a way to generate a continuous wave. And so a couple of methods emerged, one of which was the arc transmitter. And of course, these things operated at ridiculously high power levels at very low frequencies. So this is the Federal arc transmitter. And then another version was, and this is the tuning unit, by the way, this is your ATU. I think this is in Hawaii, if I recall correctly. And these were VLF type communications facilities. And then, of course, you did have some small arc transmitters. They didn't really retain any popularity, that were used for a brief time on board ship. But the arc transmitter was probably the earliest generator of continuous waves. It was very quickly displaced by a device called the Alexanderson alternator. And the Alexanderson alternator was essentially a high frequency alternator that could generate RF continuous waves. Now, there's kind of a story behind the Alexanderson alternator that's long forgotten, but this became really a key component in the geopolitical battle between the United States and the British Empire for supremacy. So the Alexanderson alternator was developed by GE, by Ernst F.W. Alexanderson, and it was being sold to the American Marconi Company. Okay, but the American Marconi Company was controlled by the British. Woodrow Wilson had a theory. Him and Colonel House had this theory that the future geopolitical domination would be determined by three factors, one of which was petroleum, the other of which was transportation, and the other of which was telecommunications, wireless communications in particular. It was accepted by Colonel House and Woodrow Wilson that the British had a superior merchant fleet, and they controlled essentially international commerce through their superior merchant fleet. However, the United States had a superior petroleum industry, and this left the trump card of international wireless communications. Whoever controlled this new technology of the Alexanderson alternator would then have two of these trump cards, you might say, a little bit like playing euchre, right? Left and right bower. And so anyway, a little bit of a skullduggery begins to emerge. And the Wilson administration eventually arranges for the sale of the assets of the American Marconi Company to a new operating company called the Radio Corporation of America. RCA was essentially a creation of the Woodrow Wilson administration, and it was created primarily as an operating company for international wireless communications. And as part of this arrangement, the Wilson administration created a patent pooling arrangement between Westinghouse, General Electric, AT&T, and of course, the new operating company, RCA. This gave RCA access to all of the key communications patents. For example, the regenerative receiver, the vacuum tube patents, and of course the Alexanderson alternator and so on. And this created what would eventually become a monster in the commercial radio and television industry in later years. But it all begins with this device right here, the Alexanderson alternator. Of course, David Sarnoff at this time was a relatively minor, personality. He was a wireless operator, and eventually Mr. Sarnoff goes to work for RCA, and he starts at the bottom, and he begins to earn the trust of people in the American Marconi and eventually RCA. As a matter of fact, Marconi liked him so much that he would give David Sarnoff the delicate task of delivering flowers and gifts to his mistresses in New York City, in the New York City area. And eventually, over the intervening years, David Sarnoff rises through the ranks of RCA to become president of RCA. And if you were to describe David Sarnoff in unkind terms, he was, I'm trying to think of the right word, he was a cutthroat businessman. And much like DeForest, but with a far higher business acumen, he also specialized in stealing the inventions of others and manipulating the legal system and so forth to ensure that RCA retained control of the radio industry. But again, during this era, we have, of course, the shutdown for World War One. Amateur radio was shut down for the duration. And it wasn't just a matter of turning off your transmitter. Radio inspectors showed up at your house. They put all of your radio equipment in a box and put a federal seal on it, and you were not allowed to use wireless communications during the war. And so essentially the ARRL goes kind of silent or into stasis. Amateur radio operators join the armed forces in large numbers. And in a way, this redeems the amateur radio service in the eyes of the government. So many radio amateurs already had some knowledge of wireless technology and the radio telegraph code that they began to be seen as an asset, as many of them enlisted in the armed forces in the United States upon our entry into World War One. And so when the war ends, there were interests that did not want amateur radio to return to the air. But fortunately, kind of our new allies in the War Department and in certain segments of government, as well as a very organized campaign by the ARRL, resulted ultimately in amateur radio being authorized to return to the air. And so the lid gets popped off, and amateur radio operators return to the air in just very, very large numbers. But things change very rapidly. While many return to the air with spark transmitters, the progress in particularly radio communications and vacuum tubes and CW during the war means that many radio amateurs were exposed to new information and new technologies, and they adopt the vacuum tube for transmitting purposes very rapidly. They very quickly learned that not only could CW be generated with vacuum tubes at much lower power levels with the same success in terms of long distance communications, but also a CW signal can be modulated. Remember, CW does not mean radio telegraphy. It means an undamped oscillation. And one of the advantages of an undamped oscillation is that you can modulate it. As a matter of fact, all of our radio devices today essentially use continuous wave, including your AM broadcast station, if you want to talk about old school. So continuous wave is not really radio telegraphy. It is an undamped oscillation. And in the early 20s, you all began to see the emergence of vacuum tube transmitters, very, very quickly. And of course, if you're from Michigan and you're of the right age, you may recognize the name Morton F. I don't know if anybody remembers Morton F., but I think many people in Michigan would gather every weekend to watch Michigan Out of Doors with Morton F. He was an early amateur radio operator in this era of about 1920, 1921. He eventually served in World War II as a communications officer in the Army Signal Corps. And when he came out, he went into the television industry and the like. But we also see hams in this early era begin to experiment with voice communications or radio telephone, particularly if they had the money to do so. Early transmitters were rather crude affairs. It wasn't uncommon for amateurs to put raw AC on the plate of their vacuum tubes. High vacuum diode rectifiers were still scarce and difficult to get. They might use something like a slop jar rectifier, which is essentially an electrolytic rectifier, where you would put a zinc and a copper electrode in a solution of borax and the like, and it would act as a diode, and you'd wire these in series of so many. I seem to recall the voltage drop was a few volts across each one, and you would use that to create a rectifier arrangement. This is a high power station here. Don Wallace's station. You can see his mason jar electrolytic rectifier and a pole pig type transformer over here. Needless to say, you wouldn't, a pretty deadly arrangement with all the exposed high voltage, but hams were that way. If you had a broadcast station or a high-end amateur station, you might use a motor generator for your plate voltage. Again, just kind of an interesting thing. All of this leads to broadcasting. Early radio amateurs experimenting with radio telephone communications get tired of saying hello test into the microphone, and they began playing some music into the microphone. And they, of course, people start to tune in and listen, essentially, mainly other experimenters early on. Now, there have been various attempts at radio broadcasting, well before World War I, but they all lacked really an audience. They were, experimental stations in which the audience was other radio amateurs and so forth. They really did not have a broadcast service, so to speak. It isn't until we start seeing newspapers get involved and so forth that we begin to see the emergence of a non-technical audience. And there's really two guys that really, play a big role in this in the early days of wireless communications. One of them, of course, is Frank Conrad, who we'll talk about, but also a gentleman in Detroit named Clyde Darr. Clyde Darr is best remembered as an illustrator. He drew many of the illustrations on the cover of QST magazines in the 1920s, up until his illness and death in 1929. But he began experimenting with voice communications and broadcasting from his home in Highland Park, Michigan. And this gathers or catches the attention of the nephew of James Edmund Scripps of Scripps Publishing and the Detroit News. And the Detroit News takes an interest in Darr's experiments, and they decide to build a broadcasting station at the Detroit News building on Lafayette Avenue in downtown Detroit. And Darr and members of the Detroit Radio Club get together and they help build the first broadcast station in Detroit, which would eventually become WWJ. But like in this era, it's important to remember there was no such thing as a broadcast station license. So WWJ went on the air as an amateur radio station, 8MK, in August of 1920. Okay, and so Darr and members of the Detroit Radio Club really start one of our first broadcast stations in Detroit, and it grows into it's still on the air today in Detroit since August of 1920. A very similar arrangement occurred with Dr. Frank Conrad in Pittsburgh. Conrad was an engineer for Westinghouse. He experimented with voice communications in his garage, and he eventually got the notice of the local newspapers, and a local store began selling radio receivers to receive his experimental broadcasts, creating an audience. And then, of course, the Westinghouse company eventually begins to take notice, and they go ahead and they build a broadcast station in Pittsburgh. And eventually they get the call KDKA. Now, of course, KDKA is often credited as the first broadcast station, and the argument the historians use is, they had a commercial license before WWJ, even though they went on the air in November of 1920, essentially a few months after WWJ did. But the reality is it's a bit of semantics. KDKA was issued a land commercial license, which really was about as applicable to broadcasting in the regulatory framework as an amateur radio license. A broadcast service was actually not defined in the Radio Act, and broadcasting as a radio service wasn't really even a construct of the regulatory agency of the time, the Department of Commerce. So really neither station went on the air operating as a, quote, broadcast station, as you might have conceived it in, say, 1922 or 1925 or later. So in many respects, you can argue that WWJ really is the nation's first broadcast station. What KDKA had was the advantage of a large corporation like Westinghouse behind it, and quite frankly, their ability to control the narrative, as is often the case in these circumstances. Regardless of who is first, I think the important thing to remember is that amateur radio operators experimenting with radio telephone communications give birth to the broadcast industry. They're the progenitors, you might say. And of course, KDKA, WWJ grow very rapidly. And then, of course, the broadcast boom takes off. And I mean, it is a craze, much like the internet was when the World Wide Web first came out. Literally everybody is becoming a DX sound and buying radios and listening in. It was a true boom. People would stay up all night trying to tune in distant broadcast stations to hear, a dance band from Omaha or, station KFI out of Los Angeles. It was truly a public craze. And of course, it really catches on, and broadcast stations begin to be established all over the country in this period from about 1920 to 1922. And it really becomes an established public service, you might say. It was such a big deal that amateur radio and broadcasting eventually get to be in a bit of conflict. Essentially, what happens is, the public is so enamored with radio that they believe it's quite capable of anything, and they begin to build receivers, buy cheap receivers, many of which were not selective. And what you end up with is interference between radio amateurs and broadcast listeners. So this is what radio was supposed to look like in 1970. I don't recall having, experienced this. I was around in 1970, but anyway, it's definitely a humorous illustration. While the broadcast industry is developing, radio amateurs begin to experiment with the shortwaves. And by shortwaves, I mean high-frequency communications. And of course, the ARRL organizes transatlantic tests, which succeed in 1921. And we have our first transatlantic reception of amateur radio signals. And it's interesting, for starters, to look at this. There's only here 6 spark transmitters that were copied in Europe versus all of these CW stations. We're beginning to see the dominance of CW as a mode of communications and the decline of spark. This is one BCG, which was built by members of the Radio Club of America. And you can see their transmitter over here. This is their antenna system and counterpoise. And then over here, you can see one of the receiving stations. It's really a pretty interesting tale. By 1923, radio amateurs are engaging in two-way communications with Europe. This is John Reinhardt's, who not only developed a very popular type of regenerative receiving tuner circuit, but he was also the person who first succeeded communicating in a two-way QSO with France in 1923. So as amateur radio is moving up into the high frequency spectrum, and we begin to discover this internet capability for international communications, broadcasting is in the middle of a boom. And essentially, particularly these inexpensive crystal receivers and the like, create a real problem in terms of broadcast interference from ham radio operators. There's many calls from broadcast listeners to have amateur radio shut down, and it really creates a problem for amateur radio in the early days. So hams take some interesting steps to try and combat this, one of which is self-regulation. So this is the operating schedule for the Indian Radio Club in Pontiac, Michigan in 1921 from their minutes. You can see here that they talk about having quiet hours. You can see here, essentially 9 to 10, local no DX open. And then later on, you begin to see quiet hours where radio amateurs don't operate from 7 to 10 p.m. This is kind of interesting because I believe somewhere in here it has a definition for DX. So here it says in 1921, DX is understood to be anything over 25 miles. So, that's That's kind of interesting. So look here, 8 to 10 p.m., no spark or CW. Okay. In other words, don't transmit during those hours to prevent interference with broadcast listeners. And so you can begin to see this kind of self-regulation emerge. Radio amateurs also try and make create goodwill with the local community by demonstrating radio concerts. Here's an example of the same radio club putting on a live concert at the Pontiac High School auditorium to demonstrate radio to the public. And QST even changes its masthead to say devoted exclusively to citizen radio, and they establish a column entitled With the Broadcast Listeners. And here you can see another development by Armstrong here, the super regenerative receiver. He was a brilliant inventor. This QST cover indicates that the ham is happy because of his quiet hours ended at 10 p.m. and now he can go on the air. In other words, he hasn't been able to transmit in the evening until after 10 p.m. Many well-known people and wealthy people got involved in ham radio in the 20s. Henry B. Joy, who was not the founder, but really the creator of the successful Packard Motor Car Company, was an avid radio amateur. And this is again from the files of the Indian Radio Club. There's a letter from Henry B. Joy of the Packard Company. And Henry B. Joy also was kind of the prime driver behind the creation of our first transcontinental highway, the Lincoln Highway, in the 1920s. And I believe his great-grandson's a ham, though I don't know if he's active. Again, over time, amateur radio begins to become more standardized. We begin to see the emergence of our familiar harmonically related bands of the high-frequency spectrum. Technology improves with good regenerative receivers, CW communications, better understanding of antennas. And this little section here from a QST magazine in the period about 1923, 1924 maybe at the latest, talking about some of the accomplishments of the amateur radio service and asking, are we downhearted? In other words, don't lose hope. And so really, a lot of hams began to see real success. Here's 9ZN in Chicago, the originators of Zenith, which of course came from the call sign. And they, of course, had quite an extensive ham radio station there near the old Edgewater Beach Hotel in downtown Chicago. Some quality broadcast receivers began to emerge, first with the TRF and then ultimately with the Nutridyne. The Nutridyne receiver was probably the preeminent receiver in the mid-20s. And then eventually, of course, the superheterodyne. There's much I could go into in this course about RCA and its domination of the broadcast receiver manufacturing industry with its control, particularly of the superheterodyne patent, but we'll save that for maybe another program. Suffice to say that most broadcast receivers in the 1920s, and at least commercial broadcast receivers for the regular listener, required a lot of batteries. Essentially a 6-volt A battery for the filament, usually very similar to an automotive battery, basically 45 to 90 volts B battery for the plates, and for better receivers, a 4.5 volt battery for grid bias. And so this was kind of the common thing back in the day. Traffic handling is a big deal in the 20s. As is the support of expeditions. For example, the Don Mix and some of the Macmillan served as radio operators in some of the Macmillan expeditions to the Arctic. They used the call sign WNP for Wireless North Pole, and they utilized amateur radio for their communications during the expedition. And this was common right up through the 1930s and the like. So here you can see, some photos of the Macmillan expedition and some of these Zenith manufactured communications devices, transmitters and receivers that went on the expedition. Public service emerges in the 20s with the primarily service to the railroads. Amateur radio operators began to work with the Pennsylvania Railroad and others, New York Central and so forth, to provide some communications when wireline services, telegraph lines were brought down by windstorms and ice storms and floods and the like. And amateur radio even develops a land type SOS signal called initially QRR, and then eventually QRRR, which was sort of an amateur radio SOS for emergency communications. The rapid demise of Spark is illustrated in this old Michigan Radioist magazine from September 1922. Here's the ARRL traffic report for the section. And if you take a look over here, there are no Spark stations reporting. Spark is almost dead by 1922. That's how fast it disappears after the First World War. Here are some typical amateur radio stations. This one here was Edward Fridgen's station in Lance, Michigan, and his name will come up here in a minute or two. So keep that one in mind. But that was Edward Fridgen's station in Lance, Michigan. And here's some other examples. Here's an amateur radio station operated by the lighthouse keeper at Standard Rock out in the middle of Lake Superior. And here you can see a cage antenna, flat top antennas, and look at the fancy counterpoise here. And somebody put a lot of effort into that antenna system. There's no international prefixes in this era. You just had your call sign district and your suffix. And here's some examples of early QSL cards. Eventually, as international communications develops, amateur radio operators develop their own system of international prefixes. This stands for North America, United States, and then 8 is, of course, the 8th Call District, AVP. This is U for United States, 1CZ. So amateurs take it upon themselves to solve that problem. We also see very rapid technological advancement, both in amateur radio as well as commercial communications. For example, you could buy a facsimile machine to experiment with facsimile communications via amateur radio in the mid-1920s. Scanning disc television begins to emerge, as well as some early experiments with electronic television. The telephone company in the 1920s masters single sideband communications for international phone circuits. Of course, aviation and police radio emerge. The VHF spectrum begins to be explored. Shortwave broadcasting emerges. The vacuum tube develops with screen grid vacuum tubes and suppressor grid vacuum tubes and things of this nature. Amateur radio also gives birth not just to broadcasting, but to police radio. In the 1920s, radio dispatch didn't exist in the early days. Essentially, the way at least the Detroit Police Department operated is you assign 2 police officers to a beat. One would stay with the car parked next to a police telephone, while the other officer walked the beat in his assigned district. When a call would come in to the police switchboard, the switchboard operator at police headquarters would go ahead and illuminate a blue light atop the police telephone box. The operator sitting in the car next to the police telephone box would take the information, the dispatch. Then he would drive the beat, the route that his officer on foot typically took, locate him. They would get in the car, and then they would drive to the location of the incident, to the police call. Obviously, this was a very long response time in an era when we began to have paved roads, modern automobiles, and a very rapid getaway on the part of criminals. And law enforcement was at a significant disadvantage by 1920. So Detroit Police Commissioner William Rutledge gets the idea that he'd like to dispatch cars using radio. And he envisioned initially a radio telegraph operator in the car, much like on the Titanic or the like, and of course a radio telegraph station at the police headquarters. So he contacts a nephew, a young man named Barney Fitzgerald. His ham call was 8BNE, and he says, would you be willing to build an experimental police dispatch system? And so Fitzgerald goes to the 13th precinct, which is sort of, or at least at the time was sort of at the center of Detroit, and he installs a 200-meter amateur radio station, and they began experimenting with police communications. And the results were mixed, but there was sufficient interest to pursue it. So eventually the Detroit Police Department applies for a license to dispatch patrol cars and the like. And of course, there's no such thing as a police radio service. So the Department of Commerce issues the Detroit Police Department a broadcast license. And they literally operate in the middle of the broadcast band under the Department of Commerce assigned call sign KOP. And they dispatch, lists of stolen cars, and police calls, and things of this nature. And but because it's a broadcast station, they also have to broadcast entertainment in between the police calls. So you might hear a live performance by Ginny Simms and the Red Apple Club Orchestra, and then you might hear a list of stolen cars. You might hear a violin concerto, and then maybe some police communications. And this goes on for a while until the Flint Police Department complains that the Detroit Police Department interrupted a violin concert for a list of stolen cars. And Rutledge decides that it's simply not practical to use a broadcast station license. So eventually they work with the Department of Commerce and others to build the first practical one-way police communication system with the dispatch center located at the Harbor Master Station at Belle Isle in the Detroit River. And again, I could do a whole program on the history of how this developed, but it's a pretty interesting history. But generally speaking, this operated just above the broadcast band in the range of about 1.7 to 2.2 megahertz at various times up until World War II. And then, of course, eventually two-way systems are developed, particularly in New Jersey and the like. And we began to see something a little more similar to what we see today. The Michigan State Police do the same. They begin to experiment with statewide police dispatching. And of course, they hire Edward Fridgen from Lawrence, Michigan, and he becomes the first operator of the Michigan State Police radio system, WRDS. Interestingly, they hired Edward Fridgen away from a guy named Henry Ford, who built an extensive radio telegraph network to communicate with his distributed manufacturing all over the Midwest, as well as key facilities at his Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad, all the way south to Cincinnati, as well as his ships traversing not just the Great Lakes, but the Atlantic Ocean down to these rubber plantations in South America. And this large Ford communication system was built behind the what today still stands as the engineering department there in Dearborn. And this is the Ford operation here. Fridgen worked for in one of the Ford remote Ford radio telegraph stations up in the Upper Peninsula in Lawrence, Michigan. And of course, eventually the Department of Commerce shuts this operation down, and they tell Ford that he has to use commercial telecommunications common carrier services. And this kind of all goes away. But the history behind the station is rather fascinating. And later on, we'll see the police radio telegraph networks emerge. And these stayed in operation in some areas, I think, at least to the late 1970s. And this is the Detroit, the Michigan State Police version up in Lansing. Network broadcasting emerges in the 1920s. Here you can see NBC, the first network, And of course, just as in the case of long distance telephone service, all of the coordination occurred by Morse telegraph. So they superimposed or composited telegraphy on the broadcast loops and distribution channels, so they could handle the network coordination and the trouble ticket orders and everything via telegraphy simultaneously on the same scarce circuits. So you see a lot of telegraph sounders here in this facility. The MARS program, Army Amateur Radio Service, emerges in the 1920s, and of course we still have it today. And we began to see some manufactured communications receivers in the period of the early mid-20s. So here's some early Greeby receivers, a Kennedy. This is a Greeby, I think it's a CR17 or 18 regenerative receiver. And then, of course, in the early 30s, we get the national SW3 and similar type radios by RATPAC and the like. And this kind of begins the evolution of amateur radio into something that we begin to recognize today and still encounter. For example, the AGS. The AGS is probably one of the first practical superheterodynes, good performing practical high frequency superheterodynes. AGS stands for Air Ground Station, and it was developed primarily for the airline industry. And it really served as the prototype, or maybe the better term is the beta type receiver before the development of the famous line of HRO receivers. And it's interesting that one of the people involved in its development was Herbert Hoover Jr., the son of President Herbert Hoover, our 31st president, who, by the way, was essentially responsible during the 1920s for preserving amateur radio, standardizing our access to the high frequencies and VHF frequencies, and ensuring that amateur radio survived the broadcast boom and all the upheaval of technological development in the 20s. Hoover was a great friend of the radio amateur. And his son, of course, I think eventually served as president of the ARRL. But here you can see, the AGS receivers, which were really the first practical superheterodyne. And then, of course, the Hammerland. Dennis will tell me whether that's a Hammerland Super Pro or not. Not Super Pro. What's the word I'm thinking of, Dennis? You can probably jump there and tell me what the model is of this. I've kind of forgotten.
Comet.
That's right. There's a Comet and Comet Pro. Thank you.
Yeah, but you can't tell from the front panel if it's a Pro or a not Pro. They look identical.
There you go. Yeah. Well, we began to see the emergence of the superheterodyne, and this really brings us into an era that we can all relate to, right? We've seen HROs and Helicrafters, receivers, and this is an FB7. It's a scaled down version of the AGS. It lacks some of the additional circuitry and so forth, what was designed for radio amateurs, and of course the ubiquitous HRO. This is Alice Bork. She was a columnist for the Chicago Tribune and a radio amateur, and she is probably most famous for her relationships with organized crime and her ability to get stories out of gangsters and corrupt politicians. And she was quite the famous columnist in her era. And you can see she's got a very advanced amateur radio station here with a nice transmitter, homemade transmitter, an AGS, HRO, etc. She was a very, very avid amateur radio operator for many years. And so now we're beginning to see an amateur radio that we can recognize. Mobile, portable radio, particularly mobile radio, begins to emerge with the 5-meter, communications networks and so forth that amateurs built. This is Don Wallace operating VHF mobile in his vehicle. We also began to see in the early 30s the emergence of commercial transmitters, commercially manufactured transmitters. Before that, in the 1920s, you pretty much had to roll your own. There weren't too many hams that bought a commercial transmitter in the 1920s. But with the development of more complex circuits, better radio telephone communications, better understanding of modulation methods, amateurs began to buy, good quality commercial transmitters and the like. So this is really the earliest days of radio. You can still find some people around who remember maybe the 1930s, 1940s, but I wanted to take you up to about that era of the early 30s and close with a couple of thoughts, and that is as we examine the world around us, every generation experiences some myopia, and they like to think that they're somehow inherently different than the generations that preceded them. But in reality, human nature and the human condition changes very little. And this illustration on the front of QST in 1923, I think, is an illustration we can all relate to, unless you're perhaps very wealthy. And perhaps some of us can also relate to this illustration on the cover of Radio News. So the more things change, essentially, the more they stay the same. So that's my presentation for this evening, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions, comments, insights you might have. So thank you for sitting through that. I'll stop the share, and any comments or other questions you might have.
Thank you, James. There's none in the chat right now. If anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute and ask, or you can put them in the chat.
No questions, no comments, no insights, no. Dennis, why don't you tell us a little bit about your collection?
I was going to say, I was going to make a comment about Cunningham. He probably had something on DeForest. That's why he never got sued.
I think he also had something on RCA and Sarnoff.
Probably true. Probably true.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's the generally accepted theory, is that you had some kind of dirt on
there was some dirt, yeah.
Yeah.
It had to be.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, right?
There you go. There you go. Nice presentation. Very well done. Some really great stuff. And yeah, like you say, it's a passion of mine. It's behind me. Some of the stuff that's back here, there's a very, very early HRO. This HRO was in the first couple of months of production, and you can tell by the pearl S meter switch, and of course the German silver dial, which eventually got painted black. But then you said 3 AGXs. One of them is actually an RHM, which was the predecessor of the AGS. And so there's an AGS, an AGSX, and the RHM. And the RHM is the one that's the high one up there, than the AGS and an AGSX in the rack here. Yeah, those are, and I saw you had a picture of an FB7. FB7 you mentioned it's like a stripped down AGS. It just was missing the RF amplifier stage.
Yep.
And so you could add an external outboard RF amp to the FB7 and end up with a receiver very comparable to the AGS.
Yep.
Nice piece of gear.
Yeah,
I'm a big National fan. James Millen's one of my heroes.
Yeah. No, I've always liked National receivers.
Yeah. You got quite a few of them.
Yeah, you're a good resource to have on here. Jim, KN4UJW, you have a question, so if I can't answer it, maybe Dennis can. What you got?
Okay, curiosity question. My dad went to college in the late 20s, early 30s, and one of the stories he used to tell was that he would wrap coils for friends and stuff to make some money. He worked at Westinghouse as an engineer. He was a radar person during World War II in Hawaii. And in later life, he was a TV repairman, and he made his own test instruments. Is there any documentation I could search to see if there's any comments about my dad?
Well, that's a good question. Probably the best source, if you wanted to find some reference to them, might be the Antique Wireless Association. They would probably be the best equipped to answer that. I think they're very similar. I'm president of the Morris Telegraph Club, an association of retired railroad and commercial telegraphers and telegraph industry employees and the like. And we maintain an archive, and it has a fair amount of genealogical type information in it, documents and things of this nature from Western Union and railroads and things of that nature. It's not open to the public, but we provided people like writers and documentarians with information out of it. And the AWA has a similar type of facility. They have an annex with a fair amount of information and data. I would contact the AWA, Antique Wireless Association. If you're interested in radio history, I'd strongly recommend you join the organization. They have some great publications and so forth to read through, and they have a conference every year and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I'd like to remind everyone there was a program just a couple weeks ago on the DLARC, the Digital Library of Amateur Radio, that's part of the Internet Archive. So if you want to look through some old magazines, information from the teens and 20s, go back and take a look at the RATPAC presentation from a couple weeks ago. And I think there's, Jim, there's a note from Bob in the chat about the Zenith radios for the Macmillan expedition did not work on long wave. The radio operator brought his own amateur radios and was able to reach the high school student Arthur Collins, who forwarded newspaper reports.
Yeah, so the Macmillan expedition didn't just communicate with Art Collins; they communicated with numerous radio amateurs throughout North America. But that's correct; it wasn't a long wave; it was a short wave, type arrangement, high frequency radio for sure. But Art Collins certainly, played a role.
Any other questions, comments? Well, Jim, thank you very much. I'm waiting for chapter 2 and 3, so need to make arrangements. We'll move on from the 20s forward and into the 30s and 40s, but that was great. Thank you very much. Tomorrow night we have AJ8B here. He's going to be talking about the amateur radio blog, but I'm sure he'll also be talking about DX because he does a number of DX productions through every week, including his column in the Ohio Section Journal. So tomorrow night, AB8J. See you same time, same Zoom station. 73, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. And good night.